On the internet, no one knows if you're a dog. This meme was originally printed in the July 5th edition of The New Yorker in 1993 and was created by Peter Steiner. No group on the internet holds this adage more closely than furries. Today, we look at furries and the history of the internet. Let's start our story at the heart of a deep, dark dungeon crawling with orcs, skeletons, traps, magic, and treasure. But not just any dungeon. A text-based, multi-user dungeon. Fighting text-based beasts with text-based cat claws is Control-F'd. Multi-User Dungeon, or MUD, is a text-based dungeon-crawling roleplay system developed by Will Crowther on a DEC PDP-10 computer in 1979. It would allow for solo gameplay through a dungeon, and once connected to other users, would become a cooperative game much like Dungeons & Dragons. A few years later, in the tail end of the 80s, MUD would make way for MUCK, a slightly more social variant of the software that would take the dungeon out and instead would have a more open world. TinyMuck was developed by Stephen White at the University of Waterloo in early 1990. Once it was online, it quickly developed a furry subclient, FurryMuck, in August that year. It became a virtual small town for furries to start gathering, talking, sharing their stories and ideas. Furries emerged from having no setting, no real context for funny animals outside of like Bugs Bunny or Alice in Wonderland. MUDs created the first tangible, user-created universes where animal people were the norm. Later, as artists became more involved, the furry fandom became more about celebrating each other and less about celebrating large corporations, though there's still plenty to love. These took off at universities amongst students. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense since the easiest access to computers with online access would have been at schools and universities. Personal computers were around, but they were like crazy expensive. Like make it rain expensive. Because these were the first networks, we can see MUDs and MUCks, furry and otherwise, pop up all over the world, starting at colleges and universities and moving into the home when PCs became more accessible. In fact, these MUDs were very popular, being some of the first high-traffic spots in cyberspace. MUDs were limited to 63 users, number 64 was reserved for the native software, so there would be a backlog of people trying to get in. It also makes sense that these were both incredibly nerdy, being the kind of kids to take computer science in the 80s, and eventually becoming 18+, adult and erotic in nature because college kids are sort of into that stuff, like a lot. Some other things to note: 1, this was a predominantly white male group based on the attendance of these types of programs within the colleges and universities. And 2, furry from the get-go was one of the first safe places for LGBT, since the nature of the fursona allows for a mask and a level of anonymity. These two factors may explain why we see such a large population of white gay males within the fandom today, though the tides are changing and we're seeing a lot more women and non-white furries. Keep in mind that this is still years ahead of the first usable internet browsers. Netscape didn't introduce the modern browser until 5 years later. This wasn't limited to furries. Other nerdy communities jumped right in. The original programming was based in a classic fantasy setting, but there was also vampire groups, sci-fi groups, groups for book discussion, film, TV, comics, just about everything nerdy. Because the internet was still in its infancy, this created a lot of visibility for the fandom for the nerdy few who had access to connected computers. Furries, being already familiar with the internet, found the means to create personal websites to show off their art or writing. And it was about this time that databases and social forums were forming, including YRF, YIFCO, and VCL, which hosted all this and other content. This was even before most major corporations had websites. There's never been one spot for internet social exchange to take place. In 2005, furaffinity.net was created and became the central, most popular site for all furry content. Presently, FA is one of the top 5,000 websites accessed in the entire web. If we look at just the US, it's in the top 2,000 websites. If anthropomorphism follows mass media, as we've been exploring, then it's inevitable that anthro characters would come to represent ourselves on the digital platform. We've gone from gods to children's stories, from cheap dime store porno to motion picture wartime propaganda. An online presence, text or otherwise, demands an avatar, a representation of yourself. And nowhere is it written that it has to be accurate. On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. This digital representation is a reflection of the self. The digital platform allows you to create any image or description to present yourself to others online. There are a lot more furries now, so it takes a lot more than just one website to contain us. We have huge presences on sites like LiveJournal or Tumblr. There are furry art site alternatives to FA like InkBunny or SoFurry, and furry started but not necessarily exclusive sites like Weasel. Furry is gaining so much traction, even sites with histories of furry bashing, banning, and bullying like somethingawful.com and 4chan are opening up and letting more furry content sneak its way in, because we're a sneaky bunch. So, to conclude, furries have been around since the very early days of the internet. And when the first conventions and funny animal gatherings started, the internet played a very important role in building the community and creating an identity for this very unique fandom, as well as granting access to the fandom to places far removed from conventions or other large groups, and spawning independent furry movements in other parts of the world. We've also learned that internet bullying comes from these very early first interpersonal programs, so being bullied on the internet for being furry is equally old. To become an active part of furry, you don't need to be an artist or a writer or a fursuiter. A key part of furry is creating an identity for yourself, an avatar to represent you or your ideal you. You don't find anything like this anywhere else except maybe MMORPGs. But more because the act of creating a fursona is in its own way contributing to the fandom and creating more content for furries to get furry about. The internet is a lot of things, but one of those things is that it brings people with common interests an equal playing field to connect, communicate, share, and build on. Culturally Apt this week was brought to you by Tubes, delivering dump trucks of information right to you, including really old jokes. Culturally Apt was also brought to you by these avatars, who apparently also exist in the real world. If you like what we do here at Culturally Apt, please hit like or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to us. If you have a suggestion for a future episode, please do not hesitate to tweet at us or post on our many walls across the internet. This week we looked at the internet and the formation of furry identity. Next week we'll look at video games and the selection choices that leave us fluffy, feathery, or scaly. See you next time.